Welcome to Patrick's Book Reviews. Okay, welcome back everybody. Today's a very exciting day because I'm actually doing a book review today, 3 book reviews. And that would seem with a name like Patrick's Book Reviews, that's mainly what I'd be doing on this channel, but this is my 8th video and this will only be the 2nd time I've actually reviewed videos on this channel. My first episode was a review of Stephen King's The Stand, and since then I've been doing some other book related videos, but I haven't got back to any reviews, so happy to be doing those today. Now today I have, like I said, 3 books to talk about, and this time I prepared myself a little bit better than the first time, so hopefully I won't be just all over the place like I was when I was talking about The Stand in my first video. So yeah, I actually took notes when I was reading this time and sort of wrote up some reviews anyway. So I decided, since I'm writing up reviews to prepare for the video, I might as well start a Goodreads account. So if you're interested in that, you can find that down in the description. And I've reviewed the 3 books that I talked about today. I've reviewed on Goodreads. The thing I don't really like about Goodreads is the 5-star rating system. It's kind of hard for me to choose between a 4 and a 5. So on Patrick's Book Reviews, I'm going to be doing a 10 star, whatever you want to call it, rating system. And at the end of the video, I'll have a list after every video where I actually rank the books that I've reviewed on this channel. So not my all-time top books, but the list of books I've reviewed on this channel. So that'll be at the end of the video, so make sure you stick around for that. But without further ado, I do want to jump into things because I have 3 books to talk about, but I feel like I have a lot to say about each book. And the first book is another Stephen King book. It's Stephen King's It. Now, I've been kind of reading a lot of Stephen King. If you watch this channel, you probably think he's my favorite author or something. He's not. Just when I began this channel, I was trying to kind of focus on maybe reading a little more modern fiction because that's not something I've read a lot of. And but I have enjoyed King so far. I was pretty high on The Stand, and I'm also pretty high on this book, It. Now, originally, my kind of experience with this book was back in the mid-90s, just seeing the VHS cassette box at my friend's house in his living room, and it just had kind of the creepy picture of Pennywise on the front. So I always just kind of associated this book, or It, with kind of like something like Dr. Giggles or something like that, just some horror thing from the 90s with a psycho clown that went around and killed people. And I was wrong about that really on 2 fronts. Firstly, the story, it's about much more than the clown. So Pennywise, in a large part, it's a coming of age story set in 1957 and 58, and also in 1985 when the characters have grown up as well. But a lot of the book's set in the 50s, and a lot of it doesn't really have to do with it or with the clown. A lot of it's just kind of dealing with bullies and things like that, and life in the 1950s and just growing up, which I liked a lot. And the other thing I was wrong about was actually Pennywise. It is much more than Pennywise the clown. That's just kind of one form that it takes, but it is an entity that's kind of much larger than just Pennywise. So it's a shapeshifter. It can take many forms, anything from like a dead loved one, to a hobo, to a werewolf, to a giant bird. It can appear in old photographs. That's a real creepy scene in the book. So there's many things that it is, but mainly really it's a force of evil that haunts the town of Derry, Maine. And it emerges every 27 years to wreak havoc on the town. Now, it emerges from the depth of the town's sewer systems, and every time it comes, there's some kind of a disaster that precedes it. So for example, in one instance, on Easter Sunday, the ironworks plant in the town has an Easter egg hunt for the children, And even though all the machinery was turned off and there was no reason for it, the plant exploded, killing many of the townsfolk. And then after that, it will come out and feed on children for a while, and then it will go back into the sewer system, only to emerge 27 years later. Now, the narrative of the book weaves back and forth between 1958 and 1985, and that's kind of interesting too. I don't know. I love stuff set in the 1950s, and that's, I don't know, it just feels nostalgic for me. I guess that's when my parents would have been young, and then the 1980s was when I was a kid. So I liked having it set in both of those times. And it's also interesting when the characters are grown up in 1985, they're coming back to the town of Derry, Maine for the first time in forever since they were kids. And so it's interesting to see that kind of, how much the town changed in their eyes and all those things. And I just think about the time from 1958 until 1985. I think much less would have changed since 1985 until now. The world has just changed so much with technology and whatnot. But so the book kicks off with a murder in 1957, I think it was, and one of the main characters, his little brother is murdered, and that happens really early in the book, so it's not a spoiler. I'll try not to spoil too much when I talk about this. And then it kind of flashes forward to 1985, and a similar thing happens with it kind of does involve bullies as well, but this happens with an older, maybe a 20-year-old or something like that, and he's beat up, but then he's finished off by it. And then we meet the Losers Club in 1985, so where they are with their lives. Now, they've all become very successful based on some skill that they had when they were children. Just to give one example, there's one of them's named Richie, and when they were young, he was always doing kind of very bad impersonations of celebrities from the 1950s. And when he's an adult in the 1980s, he's kind of a kind of shock jock radio host that does impersonations on the air, kind of reminiscent of like Howard Stern, something like that. I'm pretty sure that might be who King was thinking about. And all the characters have something like that, where they've all become fairly successful and famous. However, one member of the group, so they group together and they're all kind of kids who were bullied, and they group together in the story and they're called the Losers Club. And one member of the group, he's the only one who never left Derry, Maine. So there's 7 members, and one of them, Mike, he remains back in Derry, Maine, and he becomes the town's librarian. And he's the only one of the group that didn't become like financially successful or famous or anything like that. And he's also the only one that really remembers what happened back in 1958. When the characters leave Derry, Maine, their memories of it and the tragedies that they endured, those leave them as well. But since Mike stayed in Derry, Maine, and he's a librarian, he's also kind of a town historian, so he's very familiar with the history of the town, and he's looking back into like every 27 years what happened, because the town also kind of conveniently forgets, maybe intentionally, what happened every 27 years. So as he's seeing this, he's aware that they had made a pact back in the 1950s that if it should ever reemerge, they would come back to defeat it. And so as the murders start piling up in 1985, Mike kind of comes to the conclusion that he needs to call the group to bring them back. And like I said, much of the book is focused set in 1958. And the group forms to become the Losers Club. And all of them are the victim of a bully. There's a main bully named Henry Bowers. And he's kind of a leader of a small pack of slightly older kids. And there's, two or three or four other main bullies that join him in bullying the other kids from the Losers Club. And so he's kind of the one that drives them together. There will be circumstances where he'll be bullying one of them, and it ends up sending the other victims together in a group. And so Henry Bowers, along with it, is really the main antagonists of this book, and the entity of it also kind of feeds those people who are engaging in evil. But also, a lot of the characters' parents are also kind of portrayed as antagonists in this book. You know, most evident is Beverly's father. She's the one girl in the group, and she's got a very abusive father. Most of the characters have some kind of issue with their parents, whether it's having like an overprotective mother, or in one case, a family that had endured tragedy. They kind of become kind of apathetic and uninterested in their son. The budding friendship of the group, though, the camaraderie and the coming together, the coming of age, that's kind of really what makes this book great, in my opinion. And so there's the ideal of childhood, innocence, goodness, and also kind of the magic of childhood, placed in kind of dichotomy with the kind of cold realism of adulthood. Also the simple times, the architecture of a small American town. It all really brings a sense of nostalgia and yearning. At least it did for me. Now, it fights you with your own fears. So whatever you're afraid of, like I said, it is a shapeshifter, so it can kind of shift to whatever it is that fears you. And so the anecdote to it is to try to, it's impossible not to fear it, but a lot of times the children find a way to point its irrationality back at it, or to reflect that irrationality back at it. For example, there's one character who likes birds. He's a bird watcher, and it appears to him as a big bird. And one way that he figures out to kind of to counter attack it is to read his bird book. So he reads the names of birds, and he doesn't exactly understand why that is effective in stopping it, but it works. Maybe you can see why, but I won't say. And another thing that it tries to do is he tries to always isolate the characters, both in 58 and 85. When they're fighting against it, he tries to bring them apart, and it's really their love and their friendship, that bond that keeps them together. That's really the only way for them to defeat it. And so the only girl in the group, Beverly, she's kind of the love interest of a couple of the boys, and she's also kind of just the one that keeps the group together, that keeps that love together. Now, infamously, there is a scene in it, I won't go into that at all, where they show that love in an inappropriate manner. I think that really bothers many people, and to be honest, it bothered me too. I didn't think it was necessary at all, but it is what it is. So the town of Derry, Maine is really like another character in the story. It's been haunted by it from the beginning of its foundation, and many of the townspeople, they find it convenient maybe to kind of forget about it, or kind of let it do its thing as long as it's not bothering them. So metaphorically, you can kind of see how that could be applied to the social ills of that time, whether it be racism, discrimination, or abuse. And King really gives a vivid layout of the town, a vivid sense of the layout of the town. So you really feel Derry, Maine, and all the places within it, its geography, its buildings, the canal that runs under the town and connects to a small stream or river, the land around that river that's called the Barrens, which is where the characters hang out. It's also where the raw sewage from the town kind of filters down. So it's not an area where a lot of people are. That's why it's good for the Losers Club to kind of hang out down there. But it's also where it makes its lair in the sewer system. Now, the sewer system there is interesting as well, because it had kind of been built haphazardly, so it's just kind of spread out all over the place, and no one really knows the layout of the sewer system. So in the past, workers had gone down there and got so lost that they never found their way out. And King also takes us very deep into the history of town. So sometimes when he'll go into a story of the history of a place or an event in the town. The book almost feels more like historical fiction, even though Derry, Maine, is a fictional town. It has that feeling like that. The history parts are very strong, very vivid. So King is a master of character development, and in this book, he's really on the top of his game. I think anyone who reads this book would admit that the character building is quite incredible. So the Losers Club kind of begins with 3 or 4 of the boys. There's Richie, Bill, who's the leader of the group, Eddie, and perhaps Stan. I think he might be there in the beginning too. So Bill, he has a bad stutter. So otherwise, he's a kind of normal boy. He's kind of probably the strongest or most athletic of the group. He's tall and handsome, but he's got a really bad stutter that he's always dealing with. Richie is just kind of a nerdy, loudmouth kid, smart aleck who wears thick glasses. Eddie has asthma, and he's kind of a hypochondriac, as is his mother. So he's got an overprotective mother. That's an issue for him. And then Stan, he's just a Jewish boy who has to deal with the discrimination of being Jewish in the 1950s. And in one of the chapters, a 5th member joins the group. His name is Ben, and he's an overweight boy, and he's being chased down to the Barrens by Henry and his gang. And this is a very great scene. Ben and the boys, they end up fighting off the bullies, and they end up, they're building a dam, and Ben comes to help them. And Ben is actually very architecturally inclined. So he actually becomes an architect in the future. And so that's kind of his way into the group. The boys are very impressed as he helps them build a dam on the small river down in the Barrens. And the girl Beverly joins the group as well. Now she kind of knows Ben from being in the same class with him, and Ben has a crush on her, but they never don't talk too much or are too close. She ends up kind of joining the group as well. She knows Richie and some others as well. So she gets in there, and she's the one who, her main kind of problem is that her family's very poor and her father's very abusive. The final member who comes in the group is named Mike, and he's black, so that's kind of his deal is he has to deal with the racism of the town, the discrimination of the town. He also doesn't attend the public school. He goes to a private religious school, so he's kind of an outsider in that respect. Part of the way that King shows racism in this book is from flashbacks by Mike's father, and those are some very, very vivid story writing where it'll go back in the past to things that happened to Mike's father when he was staying on a military base in Derry, Maine in the past. Those kind of backstories really read like historical fiction, and they're very fascinating and well written. And that's really what makes it such a great book is the storytelling. It's just phenomenal in this book. King can really make anything interesting, and there's a great example of that where one of the characters, Eddie, he's the one that's using the aspirator because of his asthma. He goes to the pharmacy, and the pharmacist confronts him. And the pharmacist there, he's kind of I forgot his name, Mr. Keene, maybe. That might not be right. But he's also in another King book that I just read, 11/22/63. And he's one of those guys, he's like real serious, and it feels like he's trying to bring you down, not to really help you out, but to make you feel bad. And that's kind of what he's doing to Eddie in this scene. And it goes on for about 10 pages. He takes Eddie to his back office and buys him like a root beer float or something like that. And they're talking, and he's just kind of telling Eddie that basically his aspirator is just a placebo. He explains what a placebo is, and he tells Eddie that he's just using it as a crutch. But it's just, I don't know, it's so well written. Let me just read a brief passage from that scene. So in this scene, Eddie's respirator is on the table between them, and I suppose I could get his name now. And Mr. Keene, I was right about that name. he's talking to Eddie, and Eddie's only thinking about getting his respirator at that time because he's having breathing difficulties, because he's kind of freaking out being in the situation with Mr. Keene. A weird thought occurred to him. Maybe Mr. Keene knew he wanted it, but didn't dare ask for it. That maybe Mr. Keene was, and in parentheses, torturing, teasing him. Except that was really a stupid idea, wasn't it? A grown-up, particularly a health-dispensing grown-up, wouldn't tease a little kid in that way, would he? Surely not. It wasn't even to be considered, because consideration of such an idea might necessitate a terrifying reappraisal of the world as Eddie understood it. But there it was, so near and yet so far, like water just beyond the reach of a man who was dying of thirst in the desert. There it was, standing on a desk below Mr. Keene's smiling mica eyes. Eddie wished more than anything else that he was down in the barrens with his friends around him. The thought of a monster, some great monster, lurking under the city where it had been born and where he had grown up, using the sewers and drains to creep from place to place, that was a frightening thought. And the thought of actually fighting that creature, of taking it on, was even more frightening. But somehow, this was worse. So yeah, that's just, and like I said, that's like 10 pages. That's just like less than half a page right there. So the whole conversation, the back and forth, is really, really good. And it doesn't seem like it should be. And another really good example of King's writing and storytelling, in this case, there's a town library that, that's obviously where Mike would have worked, but also Ben as a child, he visited that library a lot. And there were two sections. There was an adult section and a children's section, which were two separate buildings, and they were connected by a glass corridor. And in this part, there was an explosion, and Ben's talking about, seeing the glass corridor after it's exploded and what that glass corridor meant to him. The tunnel, which had so fascinated Ben Haskam as a boy, would never be replaced. There had been so much costly destruction in Derry that it seemed simpler to leave the two libraries as separate, unconnected buildings. In time, no one on the Derry Council could even remember what that glass umbilicus had been for. Perhaps only Ben himself could really have told them how it was to stand outside in the still cold of a January night, your nose running, the tips of your fingers numb inside your mittens, watching the people pass back and forth inside, walking through the winter with their coats off and surrounded by light. He could have told them, but maybe it wasn't the sort of thing you could have gotten up and testified about at a city council meeting. So this really resonated with me, because as I become older, I kind of see the importance of connecting with the past, through things like history or historical places like buildings or artifacts in our lives. And it kind of keeps the past alive and keeps our connection with the past alive. And so it is very sad to go back and see that something has changed. You can think of examples. When I was a kid, I went to a brick elementary school, nice old brick building, and I haven't seen what they changed it into, but I know they did tear that down and built a new school building there instead. And so those kind of things where it's like a relic from your past is no longer there. It really resonates with me. And finally, I'd just kind of like to end this review with one more short excerpt. And I think it's another just kind of poetic little passage that I quite enjoyed. So here it is. So you leave, and there is an urge to look back just once as the sunset fades, to see that severe New England skyline one final time. The spires, the standpipe, Paul with his axe slung over his shoulder. But it is perhaps not such a good idea to look back. All the stories say so. Look what happened to Lot's wife. Best to believe there will be happily ever afters all the way around. And so there may be. Who is to say there will not be such endings? Not all boats which sail away into darkness never find the sun again, or the hand of another child. If life teaches anything at all, it teaches us that there are so many happy endings that the man who believes there is no God needs his rationality called into serious question. So we see the melancholy of leaving the past behind, but also the miracle of existing at all, and our stubbornness in not seeing it due to our so-called rationalism. But in reality, is about as irrational and stupid as one can be. But I think we've all been there. All right, the second book I'd like to review today is The Archer's Tale by Bernard Cornwell. I mistakenly thought this was Cornwell's take on the Arthurian legend, but that was actually another trilogy called the Warlord Chronicles. Archer's Tale is actually a tetralogy, and it's called The Grail Quest, so you can see how I would be confused, but this actually centers around the 100 Years' War, so it's much after the time of Arthur. And The Archer's Tale really blew away my expectations. I was expecting just a nice, solid work of historical fiction. I had heard that Cornwell was a master of battle scenes, and personally, I'm not a big battle or fight scene guy. If I'm watching a movie, I just tend to kind of zone out as there's a long fight or battle going on. But Cornwell, he does do a really good job with those battles, but that's not really what makes this book so great, in my opinion. A lot of it is not focused around battles. So it's kind of those adventures between the battles, the personal journey of our protagonists that make this book so great for me. Now, this book follows the life of our young male protagonist named Thomas, who lives in a small coastal village in Hookton, England. The village that Thomas lives in is somewhat surprisingly raided by a French party led by Sir Guillaume, but actually financed by a dark man, simply referred to as the Harlequin. And the Harlequin's not interested in plundering the village. What he's actually interested in is obtaining a relic, which was a lance that was believed to be used by St. George to kill the dragon. The Harlequin murders Thomas's father, who happens to be the village priest. So Thomas's father had relations with his maid, and that's how Thomas comes about. And the Harlequin reveals that he is the son of Father Ralph, that's Thomas's father. He is the son of Father Ralph's brother. And he claims that Thomas's father, Father Ralph, had stolen the lance and he was coming to get it back. And as Thomas's father is dying, he makes Thomas promise to bring the lance back to England. And this is all in the prologue, so I'm not really spoiling anything, at least yet. And with the death of Thomas's father and his mother, the maid is also killed in the raid. Thomas is really left with nothing. He managed to escape without being detected. And so he decides to join the English army because luckily for Thomas, as a kid, he had trained himself how to be a great archer as his grandfather was. And he kind of did this in secret because his father did not want him practicing archery. And at this point, I was just kind of figuring that the book would kind of follow the English as they fought against the French. It starts out in Brittany, and that's actually pretty much what the first part of the book is. It's still really good, but then in part two, the book takes a very interesting twist. So without spoiling too much, Thomas becomes a fugitive and is forced to depart from the English army, and he departs with a woman from Brittany. So she was one of England's enemies, and they depart together. Now she's a bit of an ambiguous figure who Thomas falls for, but she's mainly interested in getting her son back. Her son had been actually stolen from French royalty, who was a relative of her husband who is deceased. Now the story gets much more complex and intertwined throughout parts 2 and 3 as enemies switch sides and some enemies become allies and so forth. So Thomas finds out he comes from a family of Cathars, and the Cathars were a heretical sect in France who believed that the physical world was created by a malevolent God, while the spiritual world was created by a benevolent God. And so they're basically kind of dualist Gnostics, and they were repressed by the Catholic Church throughout the 14th century. And so we find out that the Harlequin, the reason he wanted to bring back the lance was because he believed in the relic's powers to bring power back to his family and France and to destroy the Catholic Church. Throughout the book, Thomas is kind of split between the dichotomy of, on the one hand, just wanting to lead a simple life in the English army as an archer. He really enjoyed that. And on the other hand, of fulfilling his promise to his father to bring the lance back, which he also promised to another priest when he made a confession. His penance was to also bring the lance back to England. So Thomas is kind of split between doing his own personal will or doing what he believes to be God's will. And culturally, religion is at the forefront of this book, and at that time. And one thing Cornwell kind of points out is the hypocrisy of both sides kind of believing God is on their side and using that to kind of justify their actions of violence against the enemy. He also shows many of the folk aspects of and superstitions of Christianity back then in England and especially in France. And one of the ways he does this I really enjoyed was Thomas wears a relic around his neck, which is a dog's paw. It's like an old shriveled up dog's paw. And Thomas actually believes it to be a relic of Saint Gwynford. And Saint Gwynford, the book explains, was actually a dog who the French, in a French tale, the dog had saved a child from being killed by a snake when the master and his wife were out. And they come back, and the dog had actually removed the child for safety, and all they see is the dog's mouth with blood all over it, and the child is missing. So the knight kills the dog, and then he comes back and realizes that he finds the dead snake and the baby was safely stowed away. And so he felt regretful for that. So he built a shrine to the dog. He buried the dog in a well, filled up the well, and built a shrine to Saint Gwynford. And so he was actually a folk saint in France. And so people would actually visit that site when they had a sick child to pray for the intercession of Saint Gwynford. And I looked this up, and this is actually a real thing. Even up to the 1970s, some French families were bringing children to the well who were sick to pray for the intercession of Saint Gwynford. However, it was suppressed by the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church did not accept Saint Gwynford as a saint. Now, Cornwell's explanations of the military technology of the time were very captivating. It was interesting because the French did not learn how to use the longbows that the English were using. And so the English had a major advantage because those were much more accurate from a further range, and they could be reloaded much faster than the French, who were using crossbows. And I'll just read a little passage from the prologue of the book, which comes back when Thomas's village was being raided by the French party. And Thomas, he was able to hide, and as they're leaving, he saw them and got ready to shoot his first actual shot at another human being. Thomas's left hand shook as he drew the bow. He was dry-mouthed, frightened. He knew he would shoot wild, so he lowered his arm and released the cord's tension. Remember, he told himself, remember everything you have been taught. An archer does not aim, he kills. It's all in the head, in the arms, in the eyes, and killing a man is no different from shooting a hind. Draw and loose, that was all. And that was why he had practiced for over 10 years, so the act of drawing and loosing was as natural as breathing and as fluent as water flowing from a spring. Look and loose, do not think. Draw the string and let God guide the arrow. So that was kind of cool, his first time shooting an arrow in an actual kind of battle situation. Overall, I love this book. Initially, Thomas is kind of one of those characters where he doesn't seem like he's really all that good of a guy. He does some bad things. And so I don't really like a book where the protagonist is kind of an ambiguous character that you're not sure if he's good or bad. But he, luckily, throughout this book, he really grows and strives to become a better person. And like I said, he's kind of wrestling with that whether to keep doing what he loves, being in the army, or to do God's will and get the lance back for his family. Now, this is just one book, of course, of a 4-book series. I think actually it was originally maybe three books, but I think the last book is called 1356, and I guess that also works as a standalone novel, but it does still have Thomas in that story. So I definitely can't wait to get into book 2 in this series. I might actually bump it up a little bit on my reading list, and I see a whole lot of Cornwell popping up in my future. Really, really love this book. Can't recommend it highly enough. Okay, and then finally, we have one more long, chunky Stephen King book. Initially, I wasn't going to read this book this month, but I finished The Archer Tale literally on November 21st, so I thought that was a very appropriate time to begin 11/22/63. And I did manage to finish it by November 30th, so I just squeaked it in there for the month of November. I had really big expectations for this book because I've heard a lot of booktubers talk about this as being their favorite Stephen King novel, and the premise for it is pretty incredible, involving time travel and all that, so it seemed really interesting. So I had really, really high hopes for it. And after finishing the book, I'm still not 100% sure how I feel about this book. I kind of have a little bit of mixed feelings. Overall, I like it, but I'll probably have to let the dust settle a bit before I really know how I feel about this book. The book centers around an English teacher named Jake Epping, and the story is told in a first-person narrative, so it's from Jake's point of view. The entire book is all in the first-person narrative. And so in the beginning, Epping's teaching in the year 2011, and he's contacted, surprisingly, at school from the proprietor of a diner, Al, who is the owner of Al's Diner, contacts him at school, which was very strange, and he tells Jake he wants to see him right away. Now, this was unusual because they're kind of casual acquaintances, kind of the customer relationship, but not particularly close or anything like that. And so Jake goes to see Al, and the first thing he notices is that Al looks really sick, and he looks much older than the last time that Jake had seen him. And that's interesting because Jake had just seen him the previous night. He had eaten at the diner. So Jake's kind of wondering what's going on. And Al slowly reveals to Jake, that he's dying of lung cancer and he needs Jake's help. And so he reveals that he's been traveling into the past, and he wants Jake to kind of take over a mission for him. And so in the back of Al's Diner, there's a little storeroom. And when you walk into that storeroom, it's like a time portal. So it takes you back to September 9th, 1958. And every time you go in there, you can stay in the past for as long as you want, but you'll age accordingly. So if you're in the past for, let's say, 5 years, you'll be 5 years older when you come back into the storeroom. However, in 2011 time, only 2 minutes will have passed. So initially, Al was using the time travel to buy cheap ground beef from 1958. Because of course, it's much cheaper than now. And so he could bring that back, and it allowed him to sell his burgers for a cheaper price. And so he did good business with that. He was able to make a large profit from that. There's an obvious contradiction because every time Al went back, he was buying the same beef over and over again. And Al kind of waves that away, being like, yeah, there's things about the time. There's these paradoxes that we just can't understand, but it works. So he goes with it. So eventually he experiments with trying to change the past to benefit someone. So he knows there's a woman who gets in a hunting accident near the time that he goes back, and she survives, but she's in a wheelchair for the rest of her life. And so he goes back and he tries to change that situation, and he does so successfully, but the time always puts up a fight against you. King keeps saying time is obdurate, meaning it's stubborn. It doesn't want to be changed. And so as he goes back to stop this hunting accident, all kind of things happen to try to prevent him from making this change. But he's able to do it, and it's successful. The woman ends up living a long, healthy life. And so then he gets to thinking like, Well, the Kennedy assassination, of course, happens on 11/22/63. So if I wait along till then, I can prevent the Kennedy assassination. Now, he believes that preventing the Kennedy assassination will lead to all kinds of other good things. He believes RFK probably will not be assassinated if JFK doesn't, because RFK would be less likely to run for president so quickly after JFK. Also, he believes that Martin Luther King Jr. would not be assassinated. He believes the Vietnam War would not escalate because he didn't think Kennedy was as gung-ho to escalate it as LBJ was. And he also thought, if King lived, that would prevent the Patty Hearst kidnapping. And so race relations in America wouldn't go as downhill as they had. So Al went back, and he did stay in the past for many years, but he couldn't quite make it up to the time of the assassination in time to stop Oswald because his lung cancer was getting so bad. He was dying, so he had to come back, and Jake was the only person he could think of to help him. So he finally convinces Jake to do it, and kind of similar to Al, Jake does some experimenting with stopping lesser crimes first. So he repeats what Al did to save the women because he couldn't let himself not do that. And then earlier in the story, Jake had an adult student who was going back to get his GED, who had been severely injured in a family murder where his father had murdered the rest of his family. He was the only survivor, but he was kind of physically and mentally handicapped, and Jake really liked him. So he went back to try to prevent that murder. Same kind of thing. He has all kinds of issues with that, with the past being obdurate, but he's able to do something, not quite exactly as perfect as he would have wanted. He comes back to check, and with the butterfly effect, now other kind of things have happened to the surviving members of the family, which maybe weren't so good. I won't go into it too much. So he goes back again and maybe takes care of that, and then he's focusing on the JFK assassination. Now, when Al had been back, he didn't succeed in his mission, but he did do a lot of sleuth work, so he took a lot of notes and everything. So Jake knows all about Oswald, and he has all kinds of information. And his identity when he goes back is his name changes to George. I forget the last name, but anyway, in the past he's named George. And after doing his first thing it was actually in Derry, Maine, so the place where it took place, and it's shortly after the conclusion of the 1958 events in it. So yes, Jake does actually meet a few characters from it, make a cameo in 11/22/63. But in Derry, Maine, that's where he stops or tries to stop the first murder, and then he makes his way through Florida, eventually gets to Texas to get close to Oswald. And in Texas, he gets a job in a small town as a school teacher. And after being in Derry, Maine, he really hated Derry, Maine. He felt the evil of the town, and he really loves the small town in Texas. He had briefly been in Dallas, and he kind of felt the same feelings with Dallas that he did in Derry, Maine. But the small town in Texas is great. Everyone's super friendly. And so he falls in love with the town, and he also falls in love with a young new school librarian. And so that kind of causes complications in his plan, because as he's getting kind of further along with Oswald, the librarian starts realizing there's something kind of up with George. And so George has to kind of like balance his love life and also his mission. Now, as far as this being kind of quasi-historical fiction or alternate history, it's probably most historical when it goes into Lee Harvey Oswald. It has a lot of information about him, and he's also featured prominently in the book. There's scenes with him and his family, dialogue with him and whatnot. So he's the character that's most heavily featured in this. And I thought King did a really nice job of how he portrayed Oswald. And he's kind of this almost pathetic character who's, he's a young man. I think he's only 22 or 23, and he became heavily influenced by communism. He actually defected to the Soviet Union, and then he was able to come back to the United States. And he had kind of decided that the Soviet Union had ruined communism by becoming too bureaucratic. But, Cuba and Fidel Castro was kind of where it was at now. And so that's where he shifted his attention. And he was actually planning to defect to Cuba, and he wasn't able to do that. And eventually, because of Kennedy and the issues between Kennedy and Cuba, that's why Oswald had focused on killing Kennedy. And King's portrayal of Oswald actually reminded me a lot of a character from The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. There's a character in there, I think Smerdyakov is actually how it's pronounced. I'm not sure though. But anyway, he's kind of he's a fourth half brother in the story that he's obviously been wronged by his father, and he's more of a servant in that story. And he kind of becomes entwined with the thinking of that time, kind of like the rationalistic, materialist, atheist thought of his time that became fashionable. But he's not kind of all that smart or all that clever, and he becomes kind of a pitiable character, as Oswald does in this story. So as George or Jake or whatever you want to call him, as he's getting closer to the time of the assassination, with time being obdurate, it keeps making everything more difficult with both him, with his girlfriend, with everything around him. And so he's struggling to get there. And I'll just kind of stop there for now because I don't want to spoil this at all. But for me, the strength of 11/22/63 kind of comes through in, like many of King's books, it's kind of the themes that it explores that are quite interesting for me. Now, of course, obviously there's time travel. I don't personally believe that time travel is possible, but it's also very interesting. There's also, of course, the butterfly effect. So, like having these actions, doing these actions in the past and seeing how that affects the future. And there's the issue of whether it's actually wise to change the past, with the butterfly effect, just because one thing that seems good to us now, if that was changed, would it actually affect the world in a good way? Or, perhaps things happen for a reason, and they shouldn't be messed with. And kind of, is time and the events that happen throughout history, are those controlled by a conscious agent? Or is it more of just a materialistic outlook where, there's just causes and effects? And then, is murder justifiable to prevent a bigger murder? Kind of reminds me of the trolley problem that you hear about in philosophy, where there's like a train running down the tracks and it's going to run over 5 people, but there's a switch there and you can switch it over and it'll only kill one fat man or something. It's always one fat man. But are you justified in making that change? And there's the question with George's love. Should his personal love supersede the good of humanity as a whole? So yeah, the themes, they're really fun to explore. So that's one thing I really loved about this book. All right, so my final thoughts on the book. I was enjoying this book as it was going along. However, I wasn't really getting why everyone was saying it was so great. It's another kind of lengthy book, and I just read 2 really long books by Stephen King, so I was maybe getting a little bit fatigued. It was getting to what seemed like was going to be the conclusion of the mission. My opinion of the book was just kind of falling a little bit. But then the last kind of 30 pages or so of the book, from page 792 to 823, I checked, those elevated the book for me. And then after that, King does do a little afterword. So there it goes on more pages after that, but not too much longer, but definitely not for those who prefer brevity. And so in this last section, we learn about this man who had appeared in the book. I forgot to mention him. He was called the Yellow Card Man, and he was just kind of this homeless man on the ground who would always be there when you entered the past. And he seemed to kind of know about what was going on with the time machine. He had some hunch for it, but he was just begging for money to go buy alcohol. And he was kind of in the late stages of chronic alcoholism. And Al had always just kind of written it off like, yeah, he's so close to it. That's probably why he's kind of onto us a little bit, but it's no big deal. But George or Jake had noticed every time he went back the man was changing a bit and his condition was getting worse. And also he had a yellow card in his hat and it kept changing colors when he went back. And then finally, towards the end, Jake meets the yellow card man's successor, who I think had a green card in his hat. And we learn more about the role of the yellow card man, which was very interesting. And then we also learn the consequences of the butterfly effect, in this book, and whether or not, that was a good or a bad thing. That was very satisfying. And I kind of agree with what I think is King's conclusion, or at least what I gathered from what happens in the book. And I also I agree with his general opinion about the Kennedy assassination and the potential conspiracy theory as well. So that was just kind of satisfying to see that everything kind of wrapped up in a way that I agreed with, but also found kind of fascinating, especially exploring the themes throughout the novel. It really gets into that in those last pages. So I think as a whole, I couldn't really say this is a great book. I'd say more like it's a very good book, because for me it kind of took a long time to get to the payoff. Now the payoff was good, the ending was good, and everything. But I can't say like this is a book that I would particularly want to reread. I don't know that I would want to go through all that again. But like I said, it'll probably take me a little bit of time to figure out what I think about this book. But right now, I would definitely place it behind it and The Stand. And speaking of ratings, on this channel, I am going to rate all the books I review on this channel. So this isn't like my all-time greatest books list, but I'll show you a list of the books that I've reviewed here. And so I'll just roll that now. And so you can see so far at the top of the list, I do have The Archer's Tale, which I gave 9.5 stars, I guess, or a rating of 9.5. And then I gave both it and The Stand 9s, and I would put it slightly ahead of The Stand. And I gave 11, 22, 63, 8.5. So yeah, there's been a lot of King so far, and that's gonna slow down a lot. I'm not planning to read another King novel for a while. I'm currently reading Shogun, and that'll be in my next review. And after Shogun, I'm not exactly sure. I'll have room for to squeeze one more book in for sure. So I'm not sure. I might go back to Cornwell because that's what I feel like doing. I also had a Guy Gavriel Kay novel, Arbonne, become available to me through my Kindle, through the library. And so I may read that. I haven't decided which way I'm going to go with that yet. So maybe let me know what you think about that. And be sure to leave your thoughts and comments in the comment section about any of these books. And I think this was a long one, but thank you so much if you made it to the end.